Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Arthur Vance laughed as he flicked a glob of lobster thermidor onto Leo Vance's shoulder in front of the gala guests. The sound was loud and braying, cutting through the refined hum of the string quartet that played near the ballroom's marble entrance. "Careful there, little brother," Arthur said, his voice carrying easily to the circle of wealthy donors. He adjusted his silk bow tie, his chest puffed out like a peacock in a bespoke tuxedo. "That suit looks like it's seen enough battles without adding butter sauce to the mix. Is it vintage or just unfortunate?" Leo didn't flinch. He felt the warm, oily weight of the sauce soaking into the fabric of his jacket, a garment Arthur didn't realize was hand-stitched by a Savile Row tailor who didn't take walk-ins. Leo simply reached into his pocket for a linen handkerchief, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's a gift, Arthur," Leo replied quietly. "From a shelter," Chloe Vance chimed in, stepping forward with a smirk that mirrored her brother's. She adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet, the stones catching the light of the crystal chandeliers with a blinding flash. "Honestly, Leo, you're at the Vance Foundation Gala. At least try to look like you share the DNA. You look like the help." Martha Vance, their mother, sighed audibly from behind her champagne flute. She didn't look at the stain on Leo's shoulder. She looked instead at Judge Alina Sterling, who was standing a few feet away, watching the exchange with a pinched, disapproving expression. "Arthur is just joking, Leo," Martha said, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. "Don't be so sensitive, and do go clean yourself up. You're making the judge uncomfortable by standing there looking like a mess." Leo caught the judge's eye. She was the social pillar of the city, a woman whose mere nod could validate or destroy a reputation. Right now, her gaze was cold, cataloging Leo as the weak link in a powerful chain. Arthur saw it too, and his grin widened. He loved an audience for his cruelty, especially one that mattered. "Tell you what," Arthur said, leaning in so the cloying smell of expensive bourbon and unearned confidence clouded Leo's senses. "I'll have my assistant send you a few of my old shirts. They'll be a bit big on you. It takes a real man to fill these out. But they'll be an upgrade from whatever dumpster you're currently diving in." The circle of guests chuckled. It was a practiced, sycophantic sound. They knew where the power lay. Arthur was the CEO of Vance Developments. Leo was the quiet one who had vanished into the world of private consulting years ago, rarely seen and easily forgotten. Leo wiped the last of the sauce away. He wasn't looking at the stain anymore. He was looking at the way Arthur's hand shook slightly as he raised his glass, the subtle, telltale tremor of a man who was spending money faster than he could steal it. "I appreciate the offer, Arthur," Leo said, his voice steady and devoid of the anger the others expected. "But I think I'll keep what I have. Things have a way of shifting when you least expect it." Arthur snorted, turning back to the judge with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Hear that? Still a dreamer. That's why Dad left me the keys to the kingdom while you were off finding yourself in the city. Some people are builders, Leo. Others are just scenery." Leo stepped back, melting into the shadows cast by the towering marble pillars. He felt a vibration in his inner pocket. It wasn't his primary phone, but the burner Uncle Silas had handed him in a dim parking garage 3 nights ago. He didn't check it yet. He didn't need to. He knew what was on it. The digital trail of the identity theft Arthur had used to drain Leo's trust fund to cover his first disastrous development deal. He walked toward the balcony, the sound of his own footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. Out here, the air was crisp and smelled of rain and the distant harbor, a welcome relief from the suffocating perfume and ego inside. "Is it done?" a voice whispered from the darkness of the stone railing. Uncle Silas stepped into the light of the moon. He looked tired, his face a map of decades of Vance family secrets. He had been Arthur's right hand for a decade, watching the rot grow from the inside until he couldn't stomach the smell of the corruption anymore. "He's as loud as ever, Silas," Leo said, looking out over the city's skyline toward the cranes that marked Arthur's failing projects. "He thinks he's untouchable," Silas muttered, handing Leo a small, heavy envelope. "He signed the final papers for the Heights project today. He used your dormant signature again, Leo. He's so arrogant he didn't even try to hide the forgery this time. He thinks you're too weak to ever check the audits. Leo felt the sharp, crisp edge of the envelope. He's right about one thing. I am scenery. But he forgot that scenery is what you hit when you lose control of the car. Silas shivered. He'd known Leo since he was a boy, but he'd never heard that particular edge in his voice. It wasn't the sound of a brother's hurt. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Marcus Thorne is waiting at the office, Silas said. He's already drafted the injunctions, but Leo, if you do this, there's no going back. Martha and Chloe, they've tied their fortunes to Arthur's lies. They'll go down with him. Leo thought of his mother's embarrassed sigh and his sister's mocking smirk. He thought of the lobster sauce seeping into his skin while they watched with glee. They made their choice when they picked the winner, Leo said. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized weeks ago. Marcus. It's time, Leo said into the receiver. Start the clock. I want the first audit hit on Arthur's desk by Monday morning. And Marcus, make sure Judge Eleanor Sterling gets an anonymous tip about the Vance Development's escrow accounts. I want her watching when the house of cards starts to wobble. He hung up and looked back through the glass doors at the glittering party. Arthur Vance was center stage again, holding court and laughing at another of his own jokes, blissfully unaware that he had just toasted to his own funeral. Leo turned and walked toward the stairs, leaving the music and the insults behind. The lion was finished sleeping. The scent of expensive oud and floor wax hung heavy in the executive suite of Vance Developments. A sharp, sterile aroma that usually signaled Arthur Vance was in a foul mood. It was barely 8 on Monday morning, but the glass-walled office already felt like a pressurized chamber. Arthur sat behind his sprawling mahogany desk, the rhythmic, heavy thud of his gold signet ring hitting the wood sounding like a slow-motion gavel. Leo Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city wake up. He could feel his brother's gaze boring into his back, a look of practiced, inherited contempt. I didn't bring you here to admire the skyline, Leo, Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished surface. The paper hissed against the wood. I brought you here to sign. I'm cleaning the dead weight out of this company, and you're at the top of the list. Leo turned slowly. He looked at the documents, then back at his brother. A surrender of interest. You're asking me to give up my remaining shares for 5 cents on the dollar, Arthur. Our father built this firm for both of us. Our father is gone, and he'd be embarrassed by what you've become, Arthur snapped. He leaned forward, the light catching the sweat already beading on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. You're a liability. That stunt you pulled at the gala on Saturday, showing up in that thrift store suit and letting everyone see you covered in sauce. It made the Vance name look cheap. I'm protecting the brand. The door clicked open, and Chloe Vance stepped in, her designer heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was carrying a tray of espressos, the bitter, over-extracted scent filling the small gap between the brothers. She handed a tiny cup to Arthur with a supportive smile before turning to Leo, her eyes scanning him with a look of pure pity. Still wearing the same shoes from last year, Leo? Chloe asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Honestly, it's for the best. If you sign those papers, Arthur might actually give you enough of a severance to buy something that doesn't scream middle management. Mom agrees, by the way. She's tired of explaining to her friends why her youngest son looks like he's struggling to pay rent. Leo took the espresso Chloe offered, the porcelain cold against his fingers. He didn't drink it. Does she? Or is she just tired of you, and Arthur threatening to cut off her allowance from the estate? Arthur's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. He slammed his palm onto the desk, making the espresso cups rattle. Don't you dare bring Martha Vance into your pathetic attempts at leverage. The estate is under my control because I'm the only one who knows how to grow it. You have 10 minutes to sign those, or I'll ensure your quiet reputation becomes a public scandal. I've already drafted the press release about your struggles with substance abuse to explain your departure. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking, a classic Arthur move, gaslighting wrapped in a threat. Leo felt the familiar heat of a rage spike, but he didn't let it reach his eyes. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and felt the cool, rectangular weight of his phone. 10 minutes, Leo repeated softly. He walked toward the desk, but instead of picking up the pen, he leaned over and looked at the digital clock on Arthur's computer. That's interesting timing. Marcus Thorne told me I should wait for the morning wire before making any big decisions today. Arthur let out a sharp, barking laugh. Thorne, that ambulance chaser you call a lawyer, he's probably at a bus stop looking for a client right now. He hasn't returned a call from our legal team in a week. That's because he's been busy with the SEC, Leo said. He finally took a sip of the bitter coffee, then set it down on the edge of the surrender documents, leaving a dark, circular stain on the top page. Arthur's laughter died instantly. His eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. What are you talking about? The Vance Tower groundbreaking is in exactly 3 days, isn't it? Leo asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. The big legacy project, the one you've leveraged every single escrow account to fund. It would be a shame if someone pointed out the discrepancies in the Vance Development's offshore holdings before the first shovel hits the dirt. Chloe's smug expression faltered. She looked at Arthur, then back at Leo. You're bluffing. You don't have the spine for a fight like that. I'm not fighting, Chloe, I'm just observing, Leo replied. Suddenly, Arthur's desk phone began to ring. Then his cell phone buzzed on the mahogany. Then Chloe's phone chimed with a high-priority notification. Arthur grabbed his cell, his knuckles white. As he read the screen, the color began to drain from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened, then closed, his breathing becoming shallow and quick. The audit, Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. How did they get the internal ledgers? Those were encrypted. Leo straightened his jacket, the one Chloe had just mocked. You should check the time, Arthur. The clock didn't just start. It's been ticking for a long time. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving the documents unsigned and the espresso cold. He didn't need to stay to hear the screaming that was about to start. He had a meeting with Uncle Silas in an hour, and the countdown to the groundbreaking was now the only thing that mattered. 3 days, Arthur, Leo said over his shoulder. Make them count. Vance stepped into the glass-walled sanctuary of Marcus Thorne's private office, leaving the frantic energy of the city streets 40 floors below. The air here was different, filtered, chilled, and smelling faintly of ozone and expensive fountain pen ink. Uncle Silas sat in a high-backed wingback chair, his frame looking smaller than it had a decade ago. He didn't look up as the door clicked shut. His gaze was fixed on the mahogany table, where a single manila folder lay like a dormant landmine. He's panicking, Leo, Silas whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. Arthur thinks he can bury the audit. He spent the last hour calling his contacts at the state treasury, trying to find a favor he hasn't already exhausted. He still thinks the world works on handshakes and golf course promises. Marcus Thorne didn't look up from his workstation. He tapped a final sequence on his keyboard, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his glasses. Let him call everyone from here to the capital. Every outgoing transmission is being logged. The more he tries to move the remaining capital to offshore shells, the more he validates the fraud patterns we've established. Leo sat across from them, his movements deliberate and calm. He didn't feel the rush of adrenaline he'd expected. Instead, he felt a profound, icy clarity. He reached out and touched the folder. The paper was heavy, textured with the weight of a decade of theft. He flipped it open. Inside was the weapon, the original deed to the Vance ancestral estate, the one Arthur claimed had been sold to cover Leo's supposed gambling debts years ago. The signature at the bottom was a crude imitation of their father's hand, a shaky forgery that Silas had finally agreed to testify against. Leo ran his thumb over the ink. It was the physical proof that his entire life had been redirected by a lie. Is the chain of custody secure? Leo asked. Waterproof, Marcus replied, finally leaning back. Combined with the internal ledgers we pulled from the encrypted server this morning, your brother isn't just looking at a corporate takeover. He's looking at a federal indictment for wire fraud and identity theft. He didn't just steal your money, Leo. He stole your name. Silas finally met his nephew's eyes. I'm sorry. I should have spoken up when your father passed. I let Arthur bully me into silence because I was afraid of the scandal. I thought I was protecting the family name. You weren't protecting the name, Silas, Leo said, his voice level and devoid of heat. You were protecting the man who was destroying it. Meanwhile, across the city, Arthur Vance was not acting like a man under threat. He stood in the center of the construction site for the Vance Legacy Towers, the wind whipping his charcoal cashmere coat around his knees. He ignored the thick layer of gray dust coating his hand-stitched Italian loafers. The sound of heavy machinery was a symphony to him, a roar of progress that he believed could drown out any legal noise. "It's a glitch," Arthur roared into his phone, his face a mottled, angry purple. "I don't care what the notification said. My brother is a pathetic little clerk who found a crack in the accounting software. Fix it, or I'll find a CFO who can do more than stare at a spreadsheet." Chloe Vance stood a few feet away, clutching her designer handbag like a shield against the grit in the air. She looked at the towering skeleton of steel and glass, then back at her brother's shaking hands. "Arthur, the bank froze the primary operating account. The caterers for the groundbreaking are demanding a wire transfer by tonight. They're threatening to pull the contract." He turned on her, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "Then pay them out of your personal account, Chloe. Do you want to be the sister of a failure? Or do you want to be standing on that stage when Judge Sterling hands me the golden key of the city?" "I don't have that kind of liquidity," she stammered, stepping back. "Everything I have is tied up in the trust." "Then sell a watch, sell the Mercedes," he snapped, invading her personal space until she stumbled against a stack of rebar. "Leo is playing a game he can't win. He thinks he's the architect of my downfall. He's nothing but a ghost in the machine. By Friday, he'll be back in his cramped little apartment and I'll be the king of this skyline." He spat on the gravel, the sound of a nearby jackhammer punctuating his defiance. He truly believed it. His arrogance was a suit of armor that had grown so thick he couldn't see the rust eating through the joints. He checked his gold watch, a gift to himself bought with money he'd diverted from Leo's education fund, and smiled at the construction foreman. "Double the shifts," Arthur commanded. "I want the podium finished by tomorrow night. Everything has to be perfect for the judge." Back in the quiet of the law office, Leo was looking at the final guest list for the event. His finger stopped on one name, Judge Eleanor Sterling. "She's confirmed," Marcus said, noting Leo's gaze. "She's looking forward to the groundbreaking. She thinks she's honoring your father's legacy by supporting his eldest son." "She is," Leo said softly, "just not in the way Arthur expects." He stood up, the manila folder tucked firmly under his arm. The countdown was no longer a threat, it was a promise. He had 48 hours to ensure every witness was in place, every document was notarized, and every exit was blocked. 2 days, Leo murmured as he walked toward the elevators. The hum of the building seemed to vibrate in his bones. He could almost hear the sound of the foundation cracking, not the one made of concrete and steel at the construction site, but the one built on a decade of arrogance. Arthur was still building his tower, unaware that the ground beneath him had already turned to sand. Leo stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the quiet office, leaving only the countdown ticking in the silence. Arthur Vance stood at the center of the oak-paneled lounge, a glass of 30-year-old scotch in one hand and a thick Cuban cigar in the other. He was surrounded by a circle of men who smelled of expensive cologne and the desperate desire to stay in his favor. The scent of cedarwood and heavy tobacco hung thick in the air, a sensory shroud of old-world privilege. Arthur was in his element, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was his personal chessboard. "The groundbreaking tomorrow isn't just about a building," he declared, the ice clinking sharply against his crystal tumbler. "It's about marking the territory. The Vance Tower will be the tallest spire in the city, a permanent reminder that some of us were born to look down on everyone else." His sycophants laughed, a chorus of practiced, hollow approval. Chloe Vance stood just behind him, her designer heels clicking nervously on the polished marble as she adjusted the silk scarf around her neck. She looked like a polished accessory, her eyes darting around the room to ensure the right people were watching her proximity to power. The heavy brass doors at the far end of the lounge swung open. Leo Vance entered, his presence a stark contrast to the performative opulence of the room. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, but lacked the loud, visible labels his brother favored. He carried a slim leather briefcase, the grain of the hide smooth and cool beneath his fingers. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he spotted his brother. "Well, if it isn't the family ghost," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you come to ask for a job on the construction crew, Leo? I might be able to find a shovel that fits your hands, though I doubt you've ever used one." The circle of men chuckled. Leo didn't flinch. He walked toward the group with a measured, rhythmic pace that seemed to quiet the room more effectively than Arthur's shouting. He stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "I came to offer a piece of advice, Arthur," Leo said. His voice was calm, a low vibration that cut through the haze of cigar smoke. "A building is only as stable as the ground it's built on. You should be careful about the foundations you're pouring tomorrow." Arthur snorted, a wet, arrogant sound. He turned to Chloe, his smirk widening. "Did you hear that? The little brother who plays with spreadsheets thinks he knows about structural engineering. Go fetch him a drink, Chloe, something weak and fruity. It'll match his personality." Chloe hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze flickering to Leo's steady eyes before she forced a mocking smile. "Of course, maybe a juice box. I think they have those in the back for the children." The room erupted in another wave of laughter. In the corner, Uncle Silas sat in a wingback chair, his shadow long against the wall. He didn't join in the mirth. He watched the brothers with a grim, knowing intensity, his hand tightening around the armrest of his chair. He was the only one who noticed the way Leo's thumb traced the lock of his briefcase, a secret power held in check. "I'm serious, Arthur," Leo continued, his tone dropping an octave. "You should double-check the zoning permits and the original land deed from 1982. There's a specific clause regarding the inheritance of the subsurface rights. It would be a shame if your tower was built on a legal sinkhole." Arthur stepped into Leo's personal space, the smell of scotch and tobacco radiating off him like a physical heat. He looked down his nose at his brother, his diamond-encrusted watch catching the light. "I have a team of 50 lawyers who have vetted every square inch of that project. You think you found something they missed? You're a hobbyist, Leo. You're a footnote in this family's history. Tomorrow I become the headline." He leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper meant only for Leo. "Stay away from the site tomorrow. You don't belong in the light. Go back to your quiet little office and wait for the crumbs I decide to throw your way." Leo didn't pull back. He met his brother's gaze with a chilling serenity. "I'll be there, Arthur. I wouldn't miss the groundbreaking for the world. Just remember, once the first stone is turned, there's no going back." "Is that a threat?" Arthur laughed, turning back to his guests. "The mouse is squeaking. Everyone look at the mouse." Leo didn't answer. He turned and walked back toward the brass doors, his silhouette sharp against the light of the hallway. As he exited, he pulled a small, encrypted phone from his pocket. Marcus Thorne answered on the first ring. "Is he taking the bait?" "He didn't even look at the hook," Leo said, his voice as cold as the marble floors behind him. "He's so blinded by his own reflection that he can't see the cliff edge. Are the documents notarized?" "Everything is ready," Marcus confirmed. "The judge is confirmed for the morning, and the press has been tipped off about a major announcement at the site. The trap is set." Leo stopped at the top of the stone steps outside the club, looking out over the city skyline where Arthur's crane stood like a skeletal finger against the moon. 24 hours, he murmured. The countdown wasn't a warning anymore. It was a sentence. He stepped into the waiting car, the door closing with a final, heavy thud that echoed through the quiet street. The grand atrium of the Heritage Museum smelled of white lilies and expensive cologne, a cloying combination that felt more like a funeral than a celebration of a real estate empire. Crystal chandeliers hummed with a low electric thrum, casting jagged shadows across the marble floors where the city's elite gathered. At the center of the room stood a large architectural model of the new Vance Plaza, its glass towers gleaming under the spotlight like a monument to a man who believed he was untouchable. Arthur Vance stood beside the model, a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a gold-plated fountain pen in the other. He was holding court, his laughter booming over the soft quartet music. He adjusted his silk tie, his chest puffed out with the predatory confidence of a man who had finally erased his brother's shadow. "It's not just a building, Alina," Arthur said, leaning toward Judge Eleanor Sterling with a conspiratorial smirk. It's a legacy, something the city will look at 100 years from now and know exactly who built it. Some people are born to create and others are born to simply watch. The judge offered a polite, measured smile, her eyes scanning the room. And your brother, I haven't seen him tonight. Arthur's lip curled in a dismissive sneer. Leo. He's probably at home, counting his pennies and mourning that little investment firm of his. I invited him, of course. Charity begins at home, after all. But I doubt he has the stomach to see what real success looks like. He always was the fragile one. Martha Vance stood nearby, nodding in agreement as she smoothed the lace on her designer gown. She reached out to pat Arthur's arm, her eyes shining with a pride she had never once directed toward her other son. Arthur has always been the pillar of this family, she added, her voice loud enough for the surrounding socialites to hear. Leo was always so quiet. It's a shame he couldn't find his footing, but some people just aren't meant for the heights. Chloe Vance chimed in with a sharp giggle, her diamonds catching the light as she sipped her drink. I saw him last week, Mother. He looked like he'd bought his suit off a rack. I almost offered him my coat check tip just to help him out. The laughter that followed was cut short by the heavy thud of the atrium's main doors swinging open. The room didn't go silent immediately, but a ripple of curiosity spread from the entrance like a cold front. Leo Vance stepped into the light, and for a moment, the air seemed to thin. He wasn't wearing the off-the-rack suit Chloe had mocked. He wore a charcoal gray tuxedo tailored with such surgical precision that it made Arthur's custom piece look bulky and dated. He didn't walk with the frantic energy of someone trying to be noticed. He moved with the steady, rhythmic grace of a man who already owned the ground beneath his feet. He didn't look at the champagne or the caviar. His gaze was fixed on the architectural model at the center of the room. You're late, Arthur called out, his voice echoing with forced bravado. He didn't like the way the light hit Leo's face. There was a stillness there that made his own skin itch. I was just telling the judge that you might have gotten lost on the way to the big leagues. Leo didn't flinch. He walked toward the model, his footsteps sounding like a countdown on the polished stone. He stopped inches from Arthur, the scent of fresh rain and cold iron clinging to him, cutting through the suffocating lilies. I wasn't lost, Arthur, Leo said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that forced those nearby to lean in. I was just making sure the paperwork was in order. A building is only as strong as its foundation, wouldn't you agree? Arthur laughed, though it sounded hollow. He threw an arm wide, gesturing to the gleaming plastic towers. The foundation is solid gold, little brother. Every permit is signed, every board member is in my pocket, and the funding is secured. By tomorrow morning, the first shovel hits the dirt. Leo leaned over the model, his finger hovering just above the glass roof of the miniature penthouse. Are you sure about that? I've spent a lot of time looking at the structural integrity of this project. It seems to me that it's built on a lot of hollowed-out promises. The insult hit Arthur like a physical slap. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson, and he stepped into Leo's personal space, his champagne sloshing over the rim of his glass. You're jealous, that's all this is. You're the failure who lost his firm, and now you're trying to cast a shadow on my greatest achievement. Look around you, Leo. These people, they're here for me. This museum, it's here because of my donations. You're a ghost in your own family's house. Leo finally looked at him. The expression in his eyes wasn't anger. It was a profound, chilling pity. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, silver-cased watch, a piece of understated luxury that made Arthur's gold Rolex look like a toy. He checked the time, then snapped it shut. It's 8:15, Leo murmured. So what? Arthur snapped. It means Marcus Thorne just finished the final filing, Leo replied. He turned his head slightly, catching the eye of Uncle Silas, who was standing in the shadows of a nearby pillar. Silas looked pale, his hands trembling as he clutched a leather briefcase, but he gave a single, sharp nod. Marcus Thorne appeared from the crowd, moving to stand at Leo's shoulder like a silent sentinel. He didn't say a word, but he handed a thin, manila envelope to Judge Sterling. The judge frowned, her brow furrowing as she felt the weight of the documents inside. What is this? She asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "A courtesy," Leo said, his eyes never leaving Arthur S. "I thought the city's most respected legal mind should have a chance to review the true ownership of the Heritage Museum site before the toast begins." Arthur's hand tightened on his glass so hard the stem creaked. "Ownership. I bought this land 3 years ago. I have the deeds." "You have copies, Arthur," Leo said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. "Copies of documents that were notarized while Uncle Silas was under considerable pressure. But the originals, the ones with the actual signatures and the untampered dates." Leo stepped back, creating a gap that felt like a canyon between them. He gestured toward the stage at the far end of the atrium, where a microphone stood waiting for Arthur's victory speech. The press was already gathering, their cameras flashing like heat lightning. "Go on," Leo said, a ghost of a smile finally touching his lips. "The world is waiting for your big announcement. Tell them all about your legacy." Arthur looked from Leo to the judge, then back to the model. His breathing had become shallow, his chest heaving under his tuxedo. He looked at Martha, but she was staring at the envelope in the judge's hands with a sudden, dawning terror. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please direct your attention to the stage. Mr. Arthur Vance has a historic announcement to make regarding the future of our city." Arthur didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the manila envelope as Judge Sterling slid the first page out. The paper was crisp, the ink dark, and the seal of the Vance estate was unmistakable even from a distance. "Arthur," Martha whispered, her voice cracking, "go up there, tell them he's lying." Leo didn't say another word. He simply adjusted his cuffs and began to walk toward the exit, his silhouette long and sharp against the museum's white walls. He didn't need to stay for the speech. He knew exactly what was about to happen when Arthur opened his mouth to claim a kingdom that no longer belonged to him. As Leo reached the heavy brass doors, he stopped and looked back one last time. Arthur was stumbling toward the stage, his face the color of ash, while Marcus Thorne leaned in to whisper something into Judge Sterling's ear. The judge's eyes went wide, and she looked up at the stage not with admiration, but with the cold, clinical gaze of a woman watching a car crash. The countdown had reached 0. The first camera lens zoomed in on Arthur's trembling hands. Leo pushed the doors open and stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy thud of the closing entrance sounding exactly like a gavel. Arthur stood behind the mahogany podium, his chest puffed out with a frantic, desperate kind of bravado. He gripped the edges of the wood so hard his knuckles were white, his eyes scanning the sea of elite faces in the museum's grand hall. The static hum of the sound system vibrated through the air, mingling with the heavy scent of ozone and expensive lilies. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing like a dry rattle. "The Vance legacy," he began, his voice wavering before he forced it into a booming register, "is not merely about buildings. It is about the strength of the men who hold the keys. My son and I have. You have nothing, Arthur." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a razor through silk. The audience turned as one. Leo walked down the center aisle, his footsteps measured and silent on the marble floor. He didn't look like a man seeking a fight, he looked like a man finishing a chore. He stopped at the foot of the stage, the light catching the sharp lines of his suit. Arthur's face darkened, a vein in his temple pulsing. "Security! Why is this man still in the building? Get this trash out of my sight before he embarrasses himself further." He leaned into the microphone, his sneer projected to every corner of the hall. "Leo has always been a disappointing shadow, a leech on the family name. Ignore him." Leo didn't flinch. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. He didn't look at the security guards who were hesitating at the edge of the room, their eyes darting toward Judge Alina Sterling. The judge sat in the front row, her spectacles perched on the bridge of her nose, her expression unreadable. "The shadow is gone," Leo said, stepping up onto the stage. He moved with a terrifying, calm grace that made Arthur stumble back a step. Leo didn't grab the microphone. He didn't need to. The room was so silent the only sound was the heavy, textured weight of the vellum deed as Leo laid it flat on the podium, right over Arthur's prepared notes. Arthur looked down. He laughed, a high-pitched, jagged sound. "What is this? Another fake contract? You're pathetic." "Read the signature, Arthur. And the date," Leo whispered. Arthur's face underwent a violent transformation, the ruddy glow of his arrogance draining away to leave a complexion the color of curdled milk. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, went wide and glassy, darting toward the document as if he could erase the digital ink with sheer will. His lower lip began a frantic, rhythmic twitch, and the polished veneer of his persona cracked, revealing a hollow, trembling ruin beneath. The sweat that broke across his brow was sudden and heavy, carving tracks through his foundation and dripping onto his silk tie. He looked like a man watching his own execution in high definition, his posture collapsing until he was leaning on the podium not for authority, but for survival. His breathing became a series of wet, shallow hitches, his mouth hanging open as he realized the seal on the paper was not from the Vance estate, but from the holding company that had spent the last 6 months quietly swallowing his debt. Judge Eleanor Sterling stood up, her heels clicking with finality as she approached the stage. She took the folder from the podium, her eyes scanning the pages with the cold, clinical precision of a woman who had seen 1,000 empires fall. "This is a certified deed of transfer," she announced, her voice carrying to the back of the hall. She looked at Arthur, her gaze filled with a profound, icy disdain. "It seems the Vance Foundation, this building, and the very ground you're standing on, Arthur, were sold 3 weeks ago. To Leo." The silence in the room broke into a cacophony of gasps. Chloe Vance, standing near the champagne tower, let her glass slip. It shattered against the floor, the sound of breaking crystal punctuating the revelation. She looked at her brother as if seeing him for the first time, her face pale. Marcus Thorne stood by the exit, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips as he checked his watch. The donors in the front row didn't just whisper, they physically shifted their chairs, creating a literal gap between themselves and the man who had just become a social pariah. Arthur reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to grab Leo's lapel. You stole this. This is my life." Leo stepped back, easily avoiding the clumsy reach. He looked at Arthur, not with anger, but with a terrifying lack of emotion. He reached out and adjusted the microphone, the screech of feedback making the audience wince. "You spent your life building a name, Arthur," Leo said, his voice amplified and absolute. "I spent mine buying the ground it stands on. You have 1 hour to clear your desk. After that, security will escort you to the curb." Leo didn't wait for a response. He didn't stay to watch Arthur collapse into the chair behind him. He turned and walked off the stage, the heavy brass doors of the hall swinging open as he approached. He stepped out into the night, the sound of the closing doors behind him as final as a lid on a coffin. The silence in the grand hall was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against the lungs of everyone present. It wasn't the respectful silence of a captivated audience, but the jagged, suffocating stillness that follows a car crash. At the center of the wreckage stood Arthur Vance. Arthur's face didn't just pale, it seemed to structurally fail. The ruddy, self-assured mask he had worn for decades dissolved into a gray, doughy mess. His lower lip trembled with a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch, and his eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, became glassy and unfocused, darting around the room as if searching for a ghost. The sweat began as a fine sheen and quickly turned into heavy droplets that tracked through his expensive bronzer, leaving muddy streaks down his sagging jowls. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man watching his own execution in a mirror he couldn't break. His shoulders, usually thrown back in a display of unearned dominance, slumped until he looked inches shorter, his expensive Italian suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. "This is a lie," Arthur croaked, the sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. He looked toward the front row, his eyes landing on Judge Eleanor Sterling. "Eleanor, tell them, this is some theatrical stunt. He's a child playing at business." Judge Eleanor Sterling stood slowly. Her gaze, which had once held a glimmer of social warmth for the Vance patriarch, was now as cold as a marble headstone. She didn't look at Arthur with anger, but with the clinical detachment one might afford a specimen in a jar. "The documents I reviewed this morning were quite clear, Arthur," the judge said, her voice carrying to the back of the hall without the need for a microphone. "The signatures are verified. The acquisition is legal. You are no longer the chairman of this firm, nor are you the owner of the Vance estate." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Chloe Vance, who had spent the last hour whispering snide remarks about her brother's shabby shoes, suddenly went rigid. She looked at the stage, then at the designer handbag resting on her lap, a bag bought with an allowance that had just been vaporized. Across the aisle, Martha Vance's hand flew to her throat, her fingers clutching a diamond necklace that suddenly felt like a noose. Marcus Thorne stepped forward from the wings, his gait steady and professional. He didn't gloat. He simply opened a leather-bound folder and held it out. "The injunction is effective immediately," the lawyer stated. "All corporate accounts associated with Arthur Vance have been frozen. The security codes for the main residence were changed 10 minutes ago." "You can't do that," Martha shouted, her voice shrill and desperate as she scrambled to her feet. She ignored her husband's collapse, her eyes fixed solely on the man on the stage. "Leo, darling, you're being impulsive. Think of the family. Think of everything I've done for you." Leo Vance turned his head slightly, his expression remaining as unreadable as a deep-sea trench. He watched his mother approach the stage, her heels clicking frantically on the polished wood. She reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch his sleeve, her face twisted into a grotesque imitation of maternal affection. "I am thinking of the family, Mother," Leo said. The calm in his voice was more terrifying than a scream. "I'm thinking of the 15 years you spent looking through me to make sure Father's drink was full. I'm thinking of the way you laughed when Chloe called me the spare parts of the Vance legacy." He stepped back, avoiding her touch with a grace that made her stumble. Martha froze, her hand hanging in empty air. The socialites in the third row, women she had hosted for tea just yesterday, were already leaning away from her, their faces turned toward their phones as they began the digital process of erasing her from their circles. "Leo, wait," Chloe called out, her voice lacking its usual bite. She hurried toward the stage, her eyes wide with a sudden, sickening realization. "We didn't know, we thought. Father said you were handled. We can fix this. We can go back to how it was." "It is back to how it was," Leo replied, finally looking at his sister. "I'm the one with the resources, and you're the one who doesn't belong in the room. Isn't that the hierarchy you always championed?" Uncle Silas stood near the exit, his arms crossed over his chest. He caught Leo's eye and gave a single, slow nod of validation. The witness had seen enough. The debt was being collected in full. Arthur finally found his feet, though he swayed like a drunkard. He pointed a shaking finger at Leo, his voice rising into a pathetic, high-pitched wail. "You think you've won? You're nothing. You're a thief. You stole my life." "I didn't steal it, Arthur," Leo said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire hall. "I bought it. At a steep discount, I might add. Your reputation was surprisingly cheap once the lies were stripped away." Leo turned to Marcus Thorne. "Ensure the guards provide them with their personal effects. Nothing else. No jewelry from the safe, no vehicles from the corporate fleet." "Leo," Arthur bellowed, a final, desperate attempt to reclaim the air. "You can't leave me with nothing." Leo paused at the edge of the stage. He looked back at the man who had spent a lifetime trying to diminish him. The rage that had fueled Leo for a decade was gone, replaced by a profound, hollow boredom. Justice didn't feel like a fire. It felt like a cold, clean room. "You have your name, Arthur," Leo said. "You always told me that was the only thing that mattered. Let's see what it buys you tomorrow." Without another word, Leo stepped off the stage. He didn't look back as the security team, led by a man Arthur had insulted only an hour prior, stepped forward to close the circle. The sound of Martha's sobbing and Arthur's incoherent protests faded as Leo pushed through the heavy brass doors. The night air was crisp, smelling of rain and distant exhaust. Marcus followed him out, his phone already buzzing with 100 inquiries from the press and the board. "The transition is complete," Marcus said, adjusting his glasses. "The locks are set. The accounts are ours. What's the next move?" Leo looked out at the city skyline, the lights of the Vance Tower glowing in the distance, a crown he had finally taken back. He felt the weight of the last 10 years settle into a quiet, permanent victory. But as he reached for the door of the waiting car, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It was an unrecognized number. He glanced at the screen. A single text message sat there, sent only seconds ago. "You think you're the only one who knows how to tear down a legacy? Look at the basement files again, Leo. You missed one." Leo froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. The cold satisfaction of the evening suddenly sharpened into a new, icy edge of uncertainty. He looked back at the closed doors of the hall, then at the dark glass of the car window. The reckoning wasn't over. It was just changing shape. 6 months had passed since the glass shattered in the ballroom of Vance Tower, and the dust had finally settled into a new, quiet reality. Leo Vance sat in the corner office that once smelled of his father's expensive cigars and unearned arrogance. Now, the air was clean, filtered by a high-tech system that hummed with a barely audible pulse. The scent of fresh mahogany and white tea lingered in the room, a sharp contrast to the stale atmosphere of the past. He looked down at the gold fountain pen in his hand, feeling its balanced weight. It was a tool for building, not a weapon for intimidation. A soft chime echoed through the office. Marcus Thorne stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the thick, charcoal-gray carpet. He didn't carry the frantic energy of the takeover weeks. He moved with the steady grace of a man whose work was validated. He placed a leather-bound folder on the desk, the texture of the grain smooth under the dim LED lights. "The final restitution checks have been cleared," Marcus said, his voice low and professional. "The families from the Heights project received their settlements this morning. Judge Alina Sterling oversaw the distribution personally. She sent her regards, Leo. She said the Vance name finally carries the weight of integrity again." Leo nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. Far below, the city moved in a rhythmic blur of yellow taxis and scurrying pedestrians. "And the basement file, the one the text mentioned." "It was exactly what you suspected," Marcus replied, leaning back slightly. "A secondary ledger. Arthur Vance hadn't just been stealing from the company, he'd been skimming from the employee pension fund for a decade. He thought he'd hidden the trail in the physical archives, assuming no one would ever look at paper in a digital age. If you hadn't found it, the fund would have collapsed by next year." The realization sparked a cold flicker of recognition in Leo's chest. His father's greed hadn't just been about status, it had been predatory. He felt a phantom weight lift from his shoulders. The final piece of the rot had been excised. "Where is he now?" Leo asked. "The outskirts," Marcus said, and for a moment, a shadow of something like pity crossed his face. "He's working at a commercial car wash near the interstate. Uncle Silas checked in on him last week. He said your father doesn't talk much anymore. He just scrubs the rims and waits for the bus." 10 miles away, the smell of industrial degreaser and stagnant water clung to Arthur Vance like a second skin. His hands, once manicured and soft, were now cracked and stained with brake dust. He stood in the shadows of the wash bay, the roar of the high-pressure hoses drowning out the world. A sleek, silver sedan pulled into the bay, the exact model he used to drive. He approached it with a bucket of soapy water, his back aching with a dull, persistent throb. As he bent down to scrub the tires, he caught his reflection in the polished chrome of the hubcap. The man looking back was hollowed out, his eyes sunken and stripped of their fire. He saw a group of young executives in the waiting area, laughing and checking their gold watches. They didn't even look at him. To them, he was a ghost in a damp jumpsuit, a nameless cog in a machine he used to think he owned. Across town, the fallout had reached the rest of the family with equal gravity. Chloe Vance stood behind the counter of a mid-tier department store, her feet burning in the sensible flats she was now forced to wear. The scent of cheap floor wax was a constant reminder of her new station. She had just finished gift-wrapping a vase for a woman who looked remarkably like her former self, impatient, entitled, and utterly oblivious to the person serving her. "Is there a problem?" the customer snapped, tapping a manicured nail on the glass. "No, ma'am," Chloe said, her voice tight. "Just making sure the ribbon is straight." She watched the woman walk away, the familiar click of designer heels on the tiles sounding like a countdown she could no longer stop. Her mother, Martha Vance, was in a small two-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, surrounded by the few pieces of furniture the creditors hadn't seized. They were safe, they were fed, but the social oxygen they had breathed for 30 years had been cut off. They were no longer the Vances. They were a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties they were no longer invited to attend. Back in the tower, Leo stood up and walked to the glass wall. The victory was absolute, the justice proportional. He had dismantled a legacy of cruelty and replaced it with something sustainable. But as he looked at the empty chair across from his desk, a quiet ache settled in his ribs. He had won the war, but he had lost the family he once hoped could be saved. The cost of the reckoning was the silence that now filled his private life. He pulled his phone from his pocket and deleted the unrecognized number that had sent the final clue. There were no more secrets to find, no more debts to collect. He turned away from the view of the city and sat back down, picking up the pen. There was work to do, and for the first time in his life, the name on the door didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a beginning. He began to sign the first of the new contracts, the scratch of the nib on the parchment the only sound in the room. He was the master of the house now, but the house was much quieter than he had ever imagined it would be.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.